September 1988.
A marine biologist steps onto one of the loneliest atolls in the Pacific, a low strip of coral and stone so remote that most maps barely seem to notice it. Wind combs through the scrub. Seabirds turn above the reef. Near the waterline, half buried in pale sand, lie the weathered remains of a small boat. Sun, salt, and time have erased almost everything that might identify it. Almost. A few registration numbers still cling to the hull. They lead back to Hawaii. The scientist studies them, and a chill passes through him. He has seen those numbers before, 9.5 years earlier, when he helped search the waters off Maui for this exact vessel after it vanished with 5 men aboard. A search he believed had ended in empty water has followed him more than 2,000 miles across the Pacific. His team moves farther inland. There, beneath a crude cross lashed together from driftwood, they find a shallow grave. The boat has returned. Only one of the 5 men has returned with it, and someone, still unidentified, placed him in the ground. This is the mystery of the Sarah Joe. It did not begin with recklessness, defiance, or a warning everyone chose to ignore. It began on a morning so calm, so clear, and so ordinary that staying ashore must have felt like the less reasonable choice. Hana sits on Maui's eastern edge, where steep green mountains descend towards a coastline shaped by rain, wind, and open ocean. In 1979, it was smaller than it is today, quieter, and bound together in a way few communities still are. Families knew one another across generations. Men worked on the same construction crews during the week, played on the same teams on weekends, and could recognize a neighbor's boat by the sound of its engine before it entered the bay. On Sunday, February 11th, the water outside Hana Bay barely moved. Relatives who stood near the shore that morning would describe it the same way for years. It looked like a lake. Ralph Malayakini looked across that flat silver surface and made a simple decision. He was 27, ran his own trucking business, and knew the waters outside Hana as part of ordinary life. That morning, he borrowed a motorboat from his twin brother Robert, a 17-foot Boston whaler powered by an 85-horsepower outboard. The craft was named the Sarah Joe, after their parents, Sarah and Joe. It was dependable for local fishing. It was not designed to shelter 5 men through a major storm in the open Pacific. Scott Moorman, also 27, climbed aboard with him. Scott was a carpenter, one of the friends Ralph had met through construction work. Then came Patrick Wozner, 26, another carpenter, Peter Hanchett, 31, a plumber, and Benjamin Kalama, 38, a tile setter and a father of 5. Their names would later appear together in search notices, memorials, and unanswered questions. But on that morning, they were simply friends setting out for a few hours on the water. Away from work, they played sports together. They were close enough, loud enough, and familiar enough as a group that friends had given them a nickname, the Nahiku Gorillas. They were not preparing to cross an ocean. They expected a short morning of fishing, and they carried what people take for a short morning, not what they would need for days beyond sight of land. There was no emergency position beacon aboard. Accounts still disagree on whether the boat carried a working radio. Some people later recalled rumors of a transmission about engine trouble. Peter Hanchett's father always maintained that there had been no radio on the vessel at all. No confirmed distress call has ever been located. At around 10 o'clock, the Sarah Joe moved out of Hana Bay. It grew smaller against the bright water, narrowed to a speck, and slipped beyond the coastline everyone in Hana knew by heart. For the next few hours, nobody had a reason to be afraid. The sea held its calm, and Hana went on with its Sunday. Then the sky changed. By early afternoon, the wind was rising with startling speed. Rain closed over the water and reduced visibility towards nothing. The smooth ocean that had promised an easy day broke into steep, confused waves. People who watched the weather turn would later remember not only the violence of the gale, but the speed with which it arrived. Faster, some said, than anything they had seen before. The channels around Maui are well known among local boaters. Wind can funnel between the island's high volcanic slopes and accelerate over open water. Conditions that seem manageable near shore may become dangerous only a few miles away. A small vessel can lose the coastline within minutes. Once rain and spray erase the horizon, even people who have known those waters all their lives can lose the direction home. By around 1 o'clock, 5 men were somewhere beyond Hana, and the storm was still building. On shore, families began watching the horizon. When the Sarah Joe failed to return, Benjamin Kalama's wife contacted the authorities. But Hana did not wait for an official operation to begin. Local boats were already pushing into the storm, into conditions dangerous enough to endanger the searchers themselves. Robert Malayakini later remembered winds above 40 miles an hour and swells he estimated at close to 40 feet in the Ala-Nui-Haha Channel. Another searcher recalled his own 26-foot boat pitching so violently that it seemed almost vertical. Those numbers are recollections, not instrument readings recorded beside the Sarah Joe. They should be understood as eyewitness estimates. Yet the central fact is not disputed. A severe storm developed with little warning, and 5 men were caught somewhere offshore in a 17-foot open boat with no confirmed way to call for help. The United States Coast Guard began a search that would last about 5 days. Aircraft flew long patterns over the ocean. Vessels pushed along the likely routes. Residents watched beaches, checked coves, and continued launching their own boats, even after the official operation ended. One officer later estimated that the search covered roughly 73,000 square miles. Families and friends kept going for weeks. They found nothing. No verified debris, no clothing, no identifiable equipment, no confirmed sightings, not even a fragment that could be tied with confidence to the Sarah Joe. And that silence created the first major contradiction in the case. If the storm had destroyed the boat completely, why would the same hull one day appear more than 2,000 miles away, intact enough to identify? The answer begins with the problem rescuers faced from the first hour, a problem courage alone could not solve. Nobody knew exactly where the men had intended to fish. There was no confirmed transmission, no beacon signal, and no reliable final position. Search planners could not place a single mark on a chart and work outward from it. They had to construct a moving field of possibilities: the time the boat left, its likely speed, the places the men often fished, the direction of the gale, and the behavior of the currents after the weather turned. Every passing hour widened the unknown. They were not chasing a fixed location. They were chasing a target. The ocean kept moving.
A disabled vessel can be pulled one way by current and pushed another by wind. Those forces do not always agree. If the Sarah Joe overturned, the hull, loose equipment, and the men themselves could have separated rapidly. A search aircraft might reach the best predicted position, only to find that the most important piece of evidence had already drifted miles beyond it. This was 1979. There was no phone aboard, creating a digital trail, no satellite messenger, no navigation system quietly storing the final course. The perfect calm of the morning had worked against them as well. Because the trip seemed routine, no one had demanded an exact destination or a precise return time. Then the storm erased the visual clues search crews normally depend on. A pale hull can be difficult to see, even on calm water. Under rain, glare, spray, whitecaps, and breaking seas, it can disappear between 2 passes of the same aircraft. A person in the water may be invisible from a distance that feels impossibly close. A crew can cross the same patch of ocean again and again, and never realize that what they are hunting has remained concealed between the waves. The complete absence of evidence felt unnatural, but it was not physically impossible. The Pacific is not a still, empty plain of blue. It is a moving system of currents, wind fields, storms, glare, and converging swells. Small objects sink, others scatter. Some pass far outside the zone where anyone thinks to look. Some remain afloat, while becoming almost impossible to see. The Sarah Joe had flotation material designed to help the hull stay above water, even if damaged. But floating did not mean upright. It did not mean visible. And it did not mean safe. The feature that may have allowed the boat to survive the ocean could do almost nothing to protect 5 exposed men from injury
exhaustion, prolonged exposure, or the violence of the sea. In the years that followed, Benjamin Kalama's family urged boaters leaving Hana to carry emergency position beacons. It was a lesson purchased at the highest possible cost, learned from a disaster in which searchers had aircraft, boats, local knowledge, and determination, but no single signal telling them where to direct any of it. In Hana, the search slowly became something heavier than an unanswered question. It became an absence woven into daily life. 5 families had no final moment to hold on to. There was no wreck explaining what the storm had done. No survivor able to describe the last hours. No single place where all 5 names could be mourned together. By every practical measure, the men were gone. Yet the vessel had vanished just as completely, and that preserved a small, stubborn uncertainty. The sea had taken the people and the evidence at the same time. Years passed. Children grew older. Families learned to build their lives around the shape of what was missing. Outside Hana, the story began to gather the familiar noise that collects around unexplained disappearances. Rumors, psychic claims, alleged transmissions, and dramatic theories that could not be verified. For strangers, the Sarah Joe became a puzzle. For the people who knew the 5 men, it never stopped being a wound. Then, in September 1988, after 9.5 years without a single confirmed trace, the Pacific returned one piece of the story and made the disappearance stranger than it had ever been. Marine biologist John Norton was taking part in a wildlife survey in the northern Marshall Islands. His team's route carried them to Bokak Atoll, also known as Taongi, more than 2,000 miles from Hawaii. Bokak is the northernmost atoll in the Marshall Islands and one of the most isolated places in the chain. Low, dry, stony ground, officially considered uninhabited. A ring of narrow islets and reef surrounds a lagoon in a region visited more often by seabirds than by people. Rain is scarce. There is no dependable source of fresh water. For Norton, the discovery carried a connection so unlikely that it sounds invented. In 1979, during the original search off Maui, he had been among those looking for the Sarah Joe. The coincidence is extraordinary, but it is not evidence of anything supernatural. Norton's work regularly took him into distant corners of the Pacific, and the 1988 expedition was surveying wildlife and possible protected areas. Yet of all the people who could have walked onto that beach, one of the original searchers was now standing beside a ruined craft whose surviving registration marks pointed back to Hawaii. At first, the possibility must have seemed absurd. Thousands of vessels had crossed the Pacific. Nearly a decade had passed. The Sarah Joe had vanished near Maui, far from the Marshall Islands. The registration marks were checked. So were the identifying numbers and the hull and engine. The wreck was the Sarah Joe. The impossible object on the beach was no longer a resemblance, a rumor, or a mistake. That single confirmation transformed the case. The vessel had crossed an enormous reach of the Pacific, perhaps in one uninterrupted drift, perhaps through a far more complicated chain of grounding, damage, release, movement, and abandonment. The wreck preserved the result, but not the sequence that produced it, and the survey team had not yet found the most disturbing evidence on the island. A short distance inland, they encountered a mound of stones beneath a cross made from driftwood. Below them, in a shallow grave, were human remains. The discovery was reported immediately. Coast Guard personnel and forensic specialists later made the long journey to examine the site. Dental and medical records established the identity. The remains belonged to Scott Moorman. For the first time since the boat left Hana, one of the 5 men had been found. But the discovery brought no account of what he had endured, no timeline, and no explanation. Only part of his skeleton had survived. Investigators could not determine a cause of death. They could not establish whether Scott had reached Bokak alive, whether his remains had arrived with the Sarah Joe, or whether another vessel had transported him to the atoll. No confirmed trace of Ralph Malaikini, Patrick Worsner, Peter Hanchett, or Benjamin Kalama was found there. But the grave imposed one unavoidable fact on every explanation, a fact the ocean alone could not account for. Scott had not simply washed onto the shore and remained exposed to the elements. Hands had gathered stones over him. A cross had been raised above him. At some unknown moment, another person had stood on an atoll officially described as uninhabited. There was another object in or near the grave, a small, unbound stack of blank paper, with thin squares of metallic foil placed between the sheets. A Coast Guard officer who examined it later described it as roughly 3 inches by 3 inches and about 3/4 of an inch thick. That is all the public record gives us with confidence. Blank paper, metallic squares, no message, no signature, and no explanation. Over time, the object became one of the most repeated details in the Sarah Jo story, and one of the easiest to distort. Its emptiness invited people to supply their own meaning. No hidden writing was ever verified. No confirmed code, symbol, or instruction was reported. Some writers have compared the paper and foil to ceremonial materials used in parts of East Asia.
The comparison may be relevant, but the object has never been publicly identified with certainty as one specific ritual item. If it was an offering, it might suggest a cultural practice. It would still tell us nothing certain about the identity of the person who knelt beside the grave and left it there. A private investigator, who later visited the atoll, proposed a more specific possibility. A fishing crew from Asia may have discovered Scott's remains, buried him respectfully, and avoided reporting the encounter because the vessel was fishing illegally or operating outside permitted waters. That scenario fits the geography. Commercial fishing boats cross remote sectors of the Pacific, and a crew encountering exposed human remains might choose burial over abandonment. But the record stops there. No vessel has been identified. No crew member has come forward. No logbook, official report, or independent account confirms that such an encounter occurred. Even the cross cannot identify its maker. A multinational crew could include people of different faiths. Someone may simply have assumed Scott was American and chosen a symbol associated with Western burial. The cross and the paper may not even belong to the same visit. Different people could have left them at different times. The grave proves that human hands entered the story. It does not tell us whose hands they were. At first, the distance from Maui to Bokak appears to be the impossible center of the mystery. More than 2,000 miles of open water seems like the part no ordinary explanation could survive. Yet specialists familiar with ocean drift have said that a vessel could make such a crossing under suitable winds and currents, potentially in months rather than years. The distance is astonishing. It is not the deepest problem. The real void is the missing time. The Sarah Jo disappeared in February 1979. It was found in September 1988. That interval does not prove the boat drifted continuously for 9.5 years. It may have covered most of the distance during its first year. It could have grounded on another reef and remained hidden until a later storm freed it. It might have floated low in the water, passed unseen through shipping routes, broken apart, and moved again. Somewhere along the way, another vessel might have found it, towed it, used it, or abandoned it near Bokak. The surviving evidence cannot distinguish among those paths. For a time, one reported detail seemed capable of narrowing those missing years. A later television account claimed that a government survey had visited Taongi after the Sarah Jo disappeared, and had reported neither the wreck nor the grave. If that account were complete, it might suggest that the boat reached Bokak only shortly before it was found. But the apparent clue weakens under scrutiny. The available public record does not show precisely which parts of the atoll were examined, how closely they were searched, or what the shoreline looked like at the time. Bokak is not one open beach visible from a single point. It is a broken ring of low islets, reefs, channels, scrub, and shorelines reshaped by tides and storms. A wreck lying low in sand or vegetation could be absent from one survey route and still present somewhere else on the same atoll. So the earlier visit does not close the timeline. The Sarah Jo may have arrived later, or it may have been there already, waiting in a corner no one happened to see. The remaining evidence permits 3 broad explanations. They are not equal in what they explain, and they do not rest on equal amounts of evidence. Each solves one part of the story by opening another. The simplest begins with the storm. The Sarah Jo may have lost power, taken on water, or overturned.
In that violence, Ralph, Patrick, Peter, and Benjamin could have been separated from the boat, while Scott remained with it, trapped within part of the vessel, caught against the hull, or somehow secured to it. Robert Malayakini later wondered whether Scott might have tied himself to the Sarah Joe as the weather worsened. No physical evidence proves that, but it offers a possible reason one man traveled with the hull while the other four vanished into the sea. Under this explanation, the storm caused the disaster. The boat later drifted towards Pokak, and an unknown crew eventually found Scott and buried him. It requires no conspiracy and no extraordinary survival. It begins with the strongest established fact in the case. A sudden, severe gale overtook a small, open vessel. Its weakness lies in everything that followed. It cannot tell us how long Scott lived, where the other four men were lost, when the Sarah Joe reached the atoll, or why the people who built the grave left no report behind. The second explanation is the most human and the most haunting. One or more of the men may have survived the first hours after the storm and remained aboard the drifting boat for a time. Several friends might have stayed together after the weather passed. Scott could have died later, somewhere along an unrecorded route. If the Sarah Joe eventually reached land, a surviving companion might have carried him ashore and built the grave. That image seems to complete the scene. One exhausted man on a dry atoll, gathering stones for his friend while the Pacific circles the reef. But the physical setting works against it. Pokak has almost no fresh water and no realistic prospect of sustaining a stranded person for long. If one of the missing men buried Scott, that survivor then disappeared as well. No confirmed shelter, tool, message, personal item or second grave was found to document his presence. The scene is emotionally compelling. The evidence does not show that it happened. The third explanation is the one that best accounts for the grave, but it creates unknown witnesses. Another vessel may have encountered the Sarah Joe somewhere at sea. Survivors, or remains, could have been taken aboard. The damaged Boston whaler might then have been towed, used, abandoned, lost again, or left drifting near Pokak. Scott could have died before the encounter, aboard the other vessel, or after reaching the atoll. Human intervention would help explain the burial and part of the missing timeline. It could also explain why the boat's journey was more complicated than a single continuous drift. But another crew would mean other eyes, other memories, and perhaps a ship's record somewhere. 5 missing men and a disabled American boat would be difficult to encounter and forget. Yet no credible witness has ever described a rescue, a recovery, or a transfer connected to the Sarah Joe. No confirmed vessel has ever been placed beside it at sea. This version explains the unknown hands at the grave. It cannot explain their silence. More dramatic theories have accumulated around the case over the years. A staged disappearance, abduction, covert activity, even paranormal intervention. None is supported by credible evidence. There is no verified sign of conflict among the men, no established motive for foul play, and no evidence that any of them planned to leave Hana permanently. The sudden storm provides a clear and sufficient explanation for the original emergency. The enduring mystery is not why the boat was in danger. The storm explains that.
The mystery begins in the hours after the weather took control, when the known record ends and the Sarah Joe starts moving through history without a witness. It survives in the Sarah Joe's passage across the Pacific, in the disappearance of 4 men who left no confirmed trace, and in the unknown hands that buried the 5th. In 1990, Robert Malayakini traveled to the Marshall Islands with private investigator Steve Goodnow and television fishing personality Hari Kojima. They went in search of answers and left a memorial marker behind. They did not find Ralph. They did not find Patrick, Peter, or Benjamin. Robert later said that the distance was simply too great for him to believe the men could have survived the entire voyage aboard such a small boat. Eventually, the Sarah Joe was brought back to Maui, completing a circle the 5 friends never did. Its paint had faded. Its name was barely visible. The hull carried the damage of a journey no one could reconstruct. Robert kept it near his home in Hana, not repaired, not returned to the water, but preserved as evidence, memorial, and physical proof that at least one impossible-looking part of the story had truly happened. The community created other memorials. Plaques were placed at Hana Bay and on the distant atoll where Scott was found.
5 trees were planted on the hillside above Hana, one for each man. Every year, a canoe tribute has carried their names back onto the water, connecting them not only to loss, but to the ocean and the community that shaped their lives. Ralph Malaikini, Scott Moorman, Patrick Worsner, Peter Hanshett, Benjamin Kalama. 5 names were preserved in memorials, family stories, and the official record. But one name has never entered the case file, the name of the person who buried Scott. That absence matters, because unsolved mysteries have a way of reducing people to quantities and clues. 5 men, 1 grave, 4 still missing. The men aboard the Sarah Joe were never pieces arranged for a puzzle. They were brothers, husbands, fathers, sons, co-workers, teammates, and friends. They made one spontaneous decision on one beautiful morning, because the sea, for once, appeared completely safe. The storm may have lasted only hours. Its consequences have lasted across generations. The evidence supports a maritime disaster, followed by a sequence no surviving witness ever recorded. It does not support one complete solution. The Sarah Joe could have drifted across the Pacific. Scott could have remained with the hull. A passing crew could have built the grave. Considered separately, each event is possible. What is missing is the chain between them, the precise sequence of choices, accidents, injuries, currents, encounters, and losses that led from a calm morning in Hana to a stone-covered grave on Bokak. Somewhere across those 2,000 miles, one story fractured into pieces. Ralph, Patrick, Peter, and Benjamin disappeared without a confirmed trace. Scott crossed an ocean by a route no one can reconstruct, and at some later moment, on a dry and isolated atoll, another human being entered the story. That person found Scott, gathered stones by hand, raised a cross, and placed him in the earth. Then the stranger left. No report followed. No ship was identified. No name entered the record. The Pacific eventually returned the Sarah Joe. It returned Scott Moorman. But it never returned the final hours of 5 friends who left Hana on a calm Sunday and did not come home. It never revealed where 4 of them were lost, when the boat crossed the ocean, how Scott reached Bokak, or how long the wreck had waited beside that reef. And it never explained the silence of the person who stood beside the grave. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of the case. Not that a 17-foot boat crossed an ocean, but that at one real and unrecorded moment, someone saw what the rest of the world had been searching for. That person saw the Sarah Joe. That person saw Scott. That person knew at least one part of what happened, and then carried that answer away without ever telling a soul.